Let's start with a simple question. Do you think Canadians and Americans are one people? They share a history, a language, and almost the same pop culture. But does that give the US the right to say Canada has no sovereignty? That its destiny is to be part of a greater America? Or take the Austrians and the Germans. The same arguments could be applied to them, after all. But the world recognizes their right to separate statehood. Why then, when it comes to Ukraine, do so many fall into the trap of imperial propaganda? Westerners often say, well, they speak Russian, so they must be Russian. But that's a mistake. The Irish speak English, but they are not British. Mexicans speak Spanish, but they are not subjects of Spain. Language is merely a tool for communication. It's no reason for annexation or manipulation. A people's right to decide their own fate is always above a neighbor's historical fantasies. To many, this war seems like a local misunderstanding, but because of this delusion, today the streets in my hometown are empty. Right now, people are being hunted there with drones. We really were neighbors. We had close ties. But today we'll look at what went wrong. Why this situation turned into an existential war. Let's go. In 1991, the Soviet Union officially ceased to exist. For the Western world, it was a triumph of democracy and the end of the Cold War. But for Ukraine, this event was something much more. It was an act of decolonization. We restored our independence, which the Russian Empire and the Soviet regime had suppressed for centuries. It's important to recall a fact that is often forgotten today. Ukraine didn't just become free, it made the world safer at the cost of its own defense. We voluntarily gave up the world's third largest nuclear arsenal. At that time, we had more nuclear warheads than China, France, and the United Kingdom combined. We gave up those weapons in exchange for written security guarantees. This document became known as the Budapest Memorandum. In 1994, Russia, the US, and the UK officially pledged to respect our borders and never use force against Ukraine. This was our massive contribution to global stability. We believed in international law and Russia's signature. Back then, Moscow officially recognized Crimea and Donbass as Ukrainian territory. But as time has shown, for the Kremlin, it was just a temporary pause to gather strength and bring its former colony back under control. Immediately after gaining independence, the acute problem of dividing the Soviet legacy arose. The main stumbling block was the Black Sea Fleet, which was based in Ukrainian Sevastopol. Crimea is the lawful territory of Ukraine, but Russia categorically refused to withdraw its troops. Years of grueling negotiations began, which sometimes escalated into physical clashes between the sailors of the two countries. In 1997, the parties signed a major treaty. Ukraine, seeking to maintain peace with its neighbor, allowed the Russian fleet to remain in Crimea on a lease basis. In return, Russia once again confirmed the territorial integrity of Ukraine. However, this decision turned out to be a fatal mistake. By allowing a foreign army to remain on its territory, Ukraine created a time bomb within itself. These military bases turned into a Trojan horse. It was this Russian contingent, already inside the country, that became the main force for starting the occupation of Crimea in February 2014. Many in the West mistakenly believe that the conflict began after the Maidan of 14, but the first real test of strength happened much earlier, in 2003. It was a conflict over the small Ukrainian island of Tuzla in the Kerch Strait. Russia suddenly, without any warning, began building a dam from its shore toward our island. Construction proceeded at a rapid pace. The dam was approaching our border at a speed of 150 meters a day. This was Moscow's first overt attempt to change borders by force after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Peace was literally 100 meters away from a major war. Ukraine reacted firmly. We deployed border guards and special forces to the island. Seeing Kiev's determination, the Kremlin backed down then. But it was a crucial signal. Moscow was testing the world's reaction and Ukraine's readiness to defend itself. That incident proved that any friendship treaties are not even worth the paper they are written on for the Kremlin. In 2004, the world saw that Ukraine and Russia are not just different countries, they are different political civilizations. During the presidential elections, the Kremlin openly tried to appoint its candidate, Viktor Yanukovych. Vladimir Putin even congratulated him on his victory several times before the official vote count was finished. But an unprecedented scandal occurred. The elections were blatantly rigged. Moreover, the main opposition candidate, Viktor Yushchenko, was poisoned with dioxin. His face changed beyond recognition overnight. It was a shock for the entire country. Millions of Ukrainians took to the main square of Kiev, Independence Square. We demanded only one thing: fair elections. We proved that power in Ukraine belongs to the people, not the Kremlin. For Vladimir Putin, the Orange Revolution became a personal insult and an existential fear. He couldn't believe that people could go out to protest on their own without money from abroad. That was when the myth of a Western conspiracy was born in Moscow. From that moment on, Russia stopped seeing Ukraine as a partner and began to see it as a threat to its dictatorship. The Kremlin realized if Ukraine becomes a successful democracy, Russians will also want change. Realizing it couldn't control Ukrainian elections with bribes or poison, the Kremlin decided to use its most powerful weapon, gas. For a long time, Russia marketed its resources as a purely commercial product, but in 2006 and 2009, the world saw Gazprom's true face. In the very middle of harsh winters, Russia simply turned off the tap. These weren't price disputes, it was political punishment of Ukraine for its pro-European course. Moscow stated directly, if you want sovereignty, you will freeze for it. But all of Europe was held hostage too, as gas transit went through our territory. Russia tried to paint Ukraine as an unreliable partner to force Europe to build bypass pipelines like Nord Stream. This was a global strategy. The goal was simple: leave Ukraine alone with the aggressor, cutting it off from the European economy and support. These gas wars became the first stage of full-scale hybrid aggression. Russia showed the whole world any dependence on its resources is a turning mechanism for political blackmail. In 2010, Viktor Yanukovych came to power in Ukraine. Moscow rejoiced. It seemed to them that Ukraine had returned to their sphere of influence forever. First thing, Yanukovych signed the so-called Kharkiv Accords. He extended the lease for the Russian Black Sea Fleet in Crimea for another 25 years. In exchange, Ukraine received a temporary discount on gas. It was a strategic trap. Russia was strengthening its military foothold inside our country, preparing for a future strike. However, Yanukovych, being an authoritarian leader, still tried to play a multi-vector game. He continued preparations for signing the association agreement with the European Union. Ukrainian society saw this treaty as a chance for reforms, fighting corruption, and civilized rules of the game. But for the Kremlin, this was unacceptable. In 2013, Putin moved to direct economic blackmail and threats. Under this massive pressure, just days before the summit, Yanukovych suddenly refused to sign the treaty with Europe. This decision became a betrayal of national interest and the spark that set the country on fire. What began as a peaceful student protest in central Kiev turned into the revolution of dignity. When the police brutally beat the youth, millions took to the streets. We stood for 3 months under snow and bullets, not for politicians, but for the right to be called Europeans. In February 2014, after the deaths of over 100 peaceful protesters, Yanukovych fled to Russia. The Kremlin calls this a coup d'etat. But look at the facts. Parliament remained legitimate. Early elections were scheduled in the country. The real coup was committed by Russia. Taking advantage of the moment when Ukraine was bled dry and weak, Putin gave the order to invade. Regular Russian troops without insignia entered Crimea. The world came to know them as Little Green Men. This was the first annexation of territory in Europe since the Second World War. Russia violated all the treaties it had signed itself. Immediately after Crimea, the war came to Donbass. Russia used its agents and weapons to create the appearance of a civil conflict. But in reality, it was the beginning of a full-scale dismantling of Ukrainian statehood. After heavy defeats of the Ukrainian army in 14 and 15, the so-called Minsk agreements were signed. The world hoped this would stop the bloodshed. On paper, it was about a ceasefire and the return of occupied territories of Donbass to Ukrainian control. But the devil was in the details. Russia demanded a special status for these regions. The Kremlin's goal was simple: to create an enclave within Ukraine controlled from Moscow that would block any movement of the country towards NATO or the European Union. This was not peace, it was an attempt to deprive Ukraine of sovereignty through legal traps. In those years, the conflict became frozen. But while Western diplomats expressed deep concern, Russia was turning occupied territories into huge military bases. We in Ukraine understood this is only an operational pause. While diplomats talked about peace, we began feverishly rebuilding our army because we understood a big blow is inevitable. In 2019, Volodymyr Zelensky became the president of Ukraine. He went to the elections with a promise to end the war. Zelensky sincerely tried to find a compromise. I believe in this. He initiated prisoner exchanges, withdrawal of troops in certain areas, and even held direct talks with Putin in Paris. Ukraine did everything possible to make diplomacy work. But the Kremlin didn't need a compromise. It needed surrender. Moscow saw weakness in Zelensky's peace initiatives. When Russia realized that even the new president wouldn't surrender independence, their tactics shifted to open terror. In 2021, Russia began an unprecedented buildup of troops along our borders. In December of that year, Moscow issued an ultimatum to the West. NATO must pack up and return to its 1997 borders. It was a demand to rewrite the outcome of the Cold War and place all of Eastern Europe under Kremlin control. In this scenario, Ukraine was supposed to simply vanish as a nation. And then, on February 24, 2022, the masks were finally torn off. Russia moved from hybrid games to open genocide. Today, this war is not a territorial dispute or a local misunderstanding. It is an existential battle. Russia is fighting for the right to be an empire and to destroy those who disagree. Ukraine is fighting for the right to simply exist. When you hear that we are one people, or that Ukraine is part of Russia, remember these 30 years. Remember the Budapest Memorandum, the Tuzla conflict, the poisoning of politicians, gas blackmail, and the annexation of Crimea. Each of these points was a choice by Russia in favor of violence. Today in my city of Nikopol, the streets are empty because Russian drones are hunting civilians. But we are not giving up because we know the difference between being neighbors and being slaves. And I hope that now you understand this difference too. Thank you for watching and take care of yourselves.